I want to take a second and shout out my team. We have two amazing women working here in Hilo full time. Serafina here in the front and Megan Blazak. You guys can give them a round of applause. They are really special, and I feel an extra duty to do a good job tonight because I want to make them and all their hard work worth something. And then Allie Katu, who's in the back, she's been helping me schedule this entire speaking tour, so you guys can give her a high five. And then Blake and Chandal, I know she's not here yet, but there are ever-present community contacts here in Hilo, so we really value you. Thank you for always sending our stuff out. So today I am here to present the key findings from our report, Pesticides in Paradise, which was released in May of this year. And I wanted to start out by telling everybody a little bit about myself. And I often make the joke that the real reason behind doing this tour is so that I can have a statewide tour of my headshot, so you guys can just stare at a picture of me for the next 5 or 10 minutes. So I'm originally from Texas. I was raised for much of my life in a very rural community in Montgomery. I lived on a lake, spent a lot of time outdoors, a lot of time in an agricultural community. Texas is a ranching state, very much like Big Island, one grocery store in the town. And I moved to Hawaii to do my PhD in political science. And I, through the course of my graduate degree, became really interested in the way that food sort of served as this site of resistance. You know, it was the way that people were trying to take back their power, resist, forms of agriculture that they found exploitative, but also food became this way that they could connect to alternatives, and that they could really feel empowered, like they could make a difference. And through that process, I became what I would call a recreational lobbyist at the Hawaii State Legislature, working largely on local food issues. So I was interested in all of the ways in which the government could affect policy changes to increase the production of local food, but also increase the consumption of food grown locally. And during my time at the legislature, probably in the first 3 years, I was operating within a context where the GMO fight was happening, but I wasn't actively engaged, and frankly, I didn't really understand all that was going on. I just knew that there was a team that was pro-GMO, and there was a team that was anti-GMO, and my legislation was oftentimes getting mired in fights that I didn't know had anything to do with it. So when the Center for Food Safety came to Hawaii to open their office, my first kind of response was thanks but no thanks. I didn't want to kind of grow into an area that I found was incredibly divisive. It was high tension. I wanted to work on what I called those spaces of yes. Areas where all parties within the agricultural and food community could come together and agree. And I think I've learned through the past 18 months of working in this position that we actually agree on a lot of things. Most people agree that we want to support farmers, give them a fair wage, compensate them fairly, make sure their practices enhance our natural environment, and that we want to be growing more food in our state. So that's where I wanted to work. But I had the opportunity early in my decision-making process to meet a group of women that were living on the island of Hawaii, who were living in a town that has experienced the impacts of pesticide drift. And I remember one mom telling me a story of picking her child up at preschool. And her child, she felt, smelled like chemicals on a regular basis. And this preschool happened to be within blocks of a GE field test site. And I thought to myself, although I really want to work in those spaces of yes, it seemed to me that there was a question of environmental justice happening here. Because I have a daughter who I send to school every day. And I don't know what I would do if I had to make that choice. I don't know what I would do if I had to potentially send my child to a school that some people feel was evacuated because of pesticide drift. And so it seems like I needed to delve in more to the research and figure out what was going on. Because it didn't seem to me that it was the kind of debate that I thought it was, a debate over an abstract technology, GE. It seemed like something was different. And in many ways, this report is a personally driven report because I wanted to do my due diligence. I wanted to look at the available data on genetic engineering and pesticide use in the island of Hawaii, and pesticide use in the state of Hawaii, see what the connections were. I wanted to get an understanding of the broader medical literature on pesticide exposure, and I wanted to really delve into what are the regulatory apparatuses that structure how these agricultural operations can and do exist in our state. So that's what we're going to go into right now are the key findings from the report that we wrote. I tell people, this report is actually 100 pages long. The full report, what I call Papa Bear, is available on our website. We also have Mama Bear, which is a 50-page version, which is in the back. We have an 8-page version, and we have a 2-page version. So you're welcome to take a look at all of the copies. The other thing that as we've gone through this tour of the state and presenting the information, people have asked us, well, where'd you get the data from? Where is this information coming from? What did you pull from when you put together this report? And we rely on sort of 4 pools of data. First, we rely on the public reporting system for GE field tests, which is through the USDA, on a website called Information Systems for Biotechnology. And that's where any entity that is participating in a field test process has to report the crop, the phenotype, what they're doing. So that was a big body of data that we analyzed. 2, we looked at the restricted use pesticide data from the island of Kauai. Currently, Kauai is the only island where we have now almost 2 years of data about the monthly pesticide applications that are happening primarily on GE seed corn and soy on that island. So that's where our pesticide use data comes from. 4th, we looked at the medical literature on pesticide exposure. And we really wanted to look at this exhaustively. It's not what do biologists tell us about pesticides or what do agricultural specialists tell us about pesticides, but what do the trained medical professionals who understand the toxicological impacts of chemical exposure have to say about what happens when children, pregnant women, workers are exposed to pesticides on a regular basis. And we looked at over 150 medical articles in the process of this and summarize our findings, and I'll share that with you. Finally, another large body of data was the discovery that came out of the DuPont Pioneer class action lawsuit in Waimea. So that was the first time that we were really able to get detailed spray logs from some of the agrochemical companies to get a sense of the frequency and intensity of pesticide applications associated, again, with GE field test sites. So first, let's set some context. What is the industry we're talking about? While I know that there's a debate largely about genetic engineering, this report looks specifically at the seed corn industry here in the state of Hawaii. And in fact, this is an industry that is rapidly expanding across our state. In terms of acreage and footprint, over the past almost 25 years, it's grown over 10 times in terms of its footprint. While at the same time, the amount of land devoted to growing fruits and vegetables in our state has declined by more than 50%. So we like to say that this is a part of the changing face of agriculture in the state of Hawaii. A lot of these seed corn companies are taking over former sugar and pine land. But compare that to the amount of acreage we use to grow diversified fruits and vegetables, you'll see it's it's almost double. So we devote about 12,500 acres to growing fruits and vegetables, and that does not include sugar and pine. The state of Hawaii actually actively supports the GE corn industry. They currently lease about 6,000 acres directly to seed corn companies. If anybody was awake during the last election season, you heard that any regulation of the seed corn industry would lead to very high economic impact. But the seed industry actually only employs about 1,400 workers in the state of Hawaii. And when you look at that, it's only 0.23% of jobs in our state. So what are they doing? If this is an industry that's rapidly expanding across our state, taking up more and more prime agricultural land, we wanted to get a sense of what actually was happening on this land. And for me, this was really important because in some of the public-facing representations of the debate, you hear a lot about niche applications of the technology. Banana, tomato, papaya, lettuce. But if you look at what actually is being tested here, you get a very, very different picture. First and foremost, Hawaii hosts more GE field tests than any other state in the nation. If you compare that to California, California hosted about 141 field test sites, 172, whereas the state of Hawaii hosted 1,141 field tests. So Hawaii has about 6 times more field tests than, for example, a state like California. So what is a field test? A field test is a part of the deregulation of a genetically engineered crop, where the person that's engaging in the genetic engineering has to be able to sort of see, does this have an impact on the ecosystem? Does it have an impact on nearby plants? Is it a crop that's going to hold, right? Does it have the robustness that they're looking for? So it's a part of their process, of proving to us that this is a crop that should be deregulated, but also testing it out themselves. If you look at what kinds of crops are being field tested here in the state of Hawaii, you'll see the vast majority of field tests are for commodity crops, namely corn and soy. Again, so when we're talking about what's happening on that 25,000 acres, it's primarily the production of genetically engineered corn and soy. So the question then becomes, well, what are they genetically engineering these crops for? If you look at the data, you'll see that the vast majority of the crops that are being field tested here are being field tested for increased herbicide resistance. So what that means is that these crops are being genetically engineered largely to withstand the greater and greater application of different pesticides. And for me, this was important because so oftentimes we hear that the technology of genetic engineering is going to create climate resilient crops or more nutritious crops. And while that might be a conversation that we want to have, that's not actually what they're genetically engineering crops to do here in Hawaii. So if they're genetically engineering crops largely to withstand the greater and greater application of herbicides, the question then becomes, well, what are the pesticidal practices associated with these field tests? And this is where it becomes a little tricky. Again, we don't have a lot of the pesticide spray data for agricultural operations in our state. We do know sales, but we don't know application. And we really only have that detailed data for the island of Hawaii. But what the island of Hawaii tells us is that genetically engineered field tests involve the heavy application and use of restricted use pesticides. First and foremost, if you look at the data from the Hawaii Good Neighbor Program, you'll see that pesticide use is year-round here in the state of Hawaii. Unlike states that also have high volumes of field test sites, namely Nebraska, Illinois, Iowa, where they have that winter respite. here in our state, they're spraying herbicides and insecticides year-round. And the highest volume of use is in our winter months, which many people know are our windy and our rainy months. And why does that matter? Well, because those are the months that pesticides are most likely to drift. Interestingly enough, if you look at the evacuations of Waimea Canyon Middle School, which the DOA has determined was stinkweed, but I think a lot of people in that community feel otherwise. All of those evacuations happened when you have high insecticide use in and around that school. We also, when you look at the kinds of pesticides that they're using, we really looked at three big names. One is paraquat, a pesticide that has had mixed history in terms of its deregulation status. It's actually been banned multiple times in the United States, but it's used frequently on the island of Hawaii. We also looked at atrazine. Atrazine is a pesticide that's persistence and impact on the natural environment has been studied by many scholars. And we looked at the insecticide chlorpyrifos. And chlorpyrifos is an organophosphate that has a lot of literature on it. So we kind of tracked these three restricted use pesticides through the medical literature to get a sense of like, well, what do doctors have to say about the potential effect of exposure to these chemicals. We only focus on RUPs in our report, in part because that's the only data we had accessible to us. But I think it's an interesting class of pesticides because it's already been deemed by the EPA as highly toxic. So the EPA has already said these are pesticides that need further regulation. And so I think it's important for us to understand where and when they're being applied in our state. So from the DuPont Pioneer litigation, we learned that a single company used 90 different pesticide formulations and up to 63 different active ingredients. Why does this matter? Well, the EPA actually only tests active ingredients one at a time. So there's actually been no testing to measure what the impact of combinations are on human health. And we know that, again, the pesticidal practices associated with GE field testing oftentimes involves a complex formulation of pesticides. Hey guys, can I ask you to stop talking? It's really distracting. Is that okay? Thanks. Secondarily, we learned that the pesticide application happens frequently. It's about 2 out of every 3 days. And companies will spray up to 16 times a day on one plot. So again, this is an industry that is spraying pesticides year-round in complex combinations, multiple times a week. So certainly the question then becomes, why? Why? Well, part of it is the nature of commodity corn production itself. Corn has the highest pesticide and herbicide use associated with it. Growing a crop to seed is pesticide intensive. But we also know that the very companies that are engaged in the genetic engineering of seeds, largely to resist the application of herbicides, so they're genetically engineering seeds that they can then sell to farmers and make money off of. Those same companies actually also manufacture and sell the pesticides that they're genetically engineering these plants to be resistant to. So it's a part of a business model. I think it's a part of understanding that pesticides and plant breeding can go hand in hand, and it can provide new profit horizons for companies that, again, have a legal obligation to their stakeholders to make more and more money. And this actually tracks with national analyses of the pesticide use associated with the introduction of GE seeds. So from 1996 to 2000, herbicide-resistant GE cotton, corn, and soybeans actually increased herbicide use by over 500 million pounds. So this tracks Again, it's a part of a model that, again, I think allows for increased sales and increased profit margins for these agrochemical companies. So why does this matter? If you think back to that moment when I met that mom on Hawaii, and I thought about sort of my personal relationship with, children's health and safety, having a kid myself, we learned in the course of our research that there are actually 27 schools within 1 mile of these field test sites. Well, why 1 mile? If you look at the medical literature, that is the explanatory variable for seeing toxicological impacts in vulnerable populations. Within 1 mile, you really start to see the health indicators of pesticide drift. But it also matters because many residents that live in and around these communities have complained about the impact of pesticide drift. I was just on the North Shore on Tuesday night for a community meeting, and hundreds of people were there, many of whom had personal stories about how it has changed on the North Shore of Oahu as the GEC corn industry has expanded, and how they have personally experienced incidences of pesticide drift. So for me, if this is an industry that's rapidly expanding across our state, and if we have reason to believe that there's increased pesticide use associated with this industry, and that communities are feeling the impact of that pesticide use, the question then becomes, well, what does the medical literature have to tell us about pesticide exposure? I think for those of us who have weighed in publicly, we're often told that we're anti-science, that the science on genetic engineering is divided, and there's nothing in the literature to tell us that this technology is safe or unsafe. There's actually, the medical literature on pesticide exposure is unequivocal. Doctors, time and time again, that are studying the toxicological impacts of pesticides will tell you that these chemicals are absolutely dangerous to human health, particularly to children, pregnant women, and workers. We reviewed in the course of this report 150 different medical studies, many of which were meta-studies, so studies of studies. So basically looks at over 500 medical studies on pesticide exposure and toxicology. And again, there are 3 classes of pronounced and determined impacts. The first is pregnant women. And any woman who's had a child knows that we ask women to observe very different practices when they're pregnant, given the vulnerability of the developing fetus. Can't eat ahi, can't eat unpasteurized cheeses. When a developing fetus is exposed to pesticides, what you see are increased rates of autism, developmental delay. You see spontaneous abortion and bad birth outcomes, largely premature birth. This tracks along with children who are exposed to pesticide drift. Children exposed to chronic low levels of pesticides have higher rates of cancer, brain cancer, leukemia. They have higher rates of respiratory illnesses like asthma. And again, you see that tracking neurodevelopmental delay. A lot of the insecticides that we looked at, this class organophosphates, it's a neurotoxin. It's designed to disrupt the neurological functioning of insects. So it's not a surprise that as we've studied the impact on children, we see those same neurological impacts. And then finally, these pesticides are incredibly dangerous to the people who apply them, the farm workers. There's one study we look at in our report that shows that farm workers that regularly apply 2,4-D have upwards of 10 times greater rates of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Again, in the farm worker community, you see higher rates of cancer. And just this week, the EPA actually changed the rules governing who can apply restricted use pesticides, not only because of the danger, but because of the age of the applicator mattered. And they said if you're not 18, you cannot be engaged in the application of restricted use pesticides. These chemicals also have an impact on our endangered species, those species that make Hawaii a unique and wonderful place. We identified in the literature 5 species that are particularly vulnerable to pesticide exposure, and we're actually going to be spending the next year really delving into this question and considering, what are the threats that high volumes of pesticide use pose to Hawaii's biodiversity. So then the final question, right? Industry rapidly expanding. We know that there's a high volume of pesticide use associated with this industry, and we know that the medical literature on pesticide exposure is clear. We absolutely need to protect vulnerable populations from pesticide drift. The question then becomes, are we protected by the EPA? Are regulations already in place that could ensure the long-term health and safety of Hawaii's people? The short answer is no. First and foremost, the EPA does not do any human testing. They only test on animals, and obviously we understand that being able to test the neurological impacts in a rat versus a child, you're never really going to get clear, determined conclusions. 2, the EPA only tests the active ingredient on its own. So they're not testing the potential impact of those chemical combinations. And when we've been meeting with doctors over the past year, what they'll tell you is absolutely. Doctors understand that you can't mix certain medications or you'll get potentially lethal impact. So it intuitively makes sense, again, those who understand toxicological impacts, that we can't just test single ingredients, we have to look at combinations. Additionally, the EPA has regularly deregulated chemicals that after 10, 15 years on the market, they've pulled out. And in the past, 18 months of having this job, Hawaii actually has a really interesting history of pesticidal poisonings. Everybody remembers the heptachlor contamination of milk. The islands of Maui and Lanai have, stories of DDT getting into their aquifers. We know that, again, the EPA regularly pulls chemicals off the market. But then you also have chemicals like chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos is a chemical that, upon looking at the medical literature that looks at the neurological impacts of this class of insecticide, the EPA said, we need to ban it in home use. We need to make sure that people are not applying the stuff at their homes. So what that means is that here in the state of Hawaii, my daughter, who lives in urban Honolulu, is afforded protections by the EPA that children in rural communities, like Waimea, like Kekaha, don't have. So we have a mixed bag of regulations around certain chemicals, again, that help us to understand why it is rural communities in our state that are really feeling the health impacts of these pesticides. The other thing that I wanted to say is in the process of doing these presentations, one of the things that has come up is the question about school evacuations and acute exposure incidences. So an acute exposure to pesticide would be something that's so obvious to you that you would then report it. And our state has a 2-tiered reporting system for pesticide exposure. So if you're exposed to pesticides, you need to make 2 calls. One, you need to call the pesticide branch and let them know that you think a farmer is, inappropriately applying pesticides. In the state of Hawaii, we have a very limited number of pesticide inspectors. And in fact, in a public meeting with Tom Matsuda on Tuesday, he said that for anybody who's licensed to apply restricted use pesticides, they're inspected once over a 5-year period. So first is the reporting to the DOA, and then if you feel that there's a potential health impact of that pesticide exposure, you would report it to the Department of Health. In some states, the Department of Health handles all pesticide regulation, but in our state, there's 2 agencies at the helm. But if you look at the medical literature on pesticide exposure, again, we're not talking about acute incidences here. We're talking about chronic, low-level, daily exposure to chemicals and the long-term health impacts that low-level exposure has. So that's an exposure to pesticides that one would probably not report. One wouldn't call the DOA because it's almost indetectable. There's a study that we work heavily with in our pesticide report. It's called the CHARGE study out of UC Davis. And what they did is they followed a cohort of children over a 14-year period. And those children lived in and around agricultural areas, but their mothers were potentially exposed to pesticides during pregnancy. And those children showed a 7 times more likely chance to have learning delays, like autism and ADHD, than other children. So chronic low-level exposure is absolutely a reason to trigger greater regulation of pesticides. And again, when we meet with doctors, they say, of course. I mean, this is the logic of pediatrics. The logic of pediatrics is prevention. You don't, for example, vaccinate somebody for measles a month after exposure. It's about creating, again, reduced risk for massive populations. So doctors came together and actually reviewed the toxicological literature. And the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2011 released a policy statement saying, given the threats that pesticides pose to children's health, we as pediatricians recommend that states adopt buffer zones around sensitive areas, particularly those areas where we're going to find pregnant women and children. I wanted to end this, not on this sort of alarmist debate, or alarmist point that, if you look at the medical literature, it's clear. We need to regulate the application of pesticides. We need to protect our children. I wanted to end on, something that I've also learned throughout my time here in Hawaii. How many of you have ever used the hashtag #LuckyWeLiveHawaii? Anybody? This is a hashtag I often use myself, and if you search the hashtag on Instagram, you get pictures like this. Those sort of natural island, sort of oceanscapes and forests. You get pictures of our flora and our fauna, and all of those things that kind of make us take a moment and think, wow, we're incredibly lucky to live in this state. In fact, today when I was flying in, seeing the amount of waterfalls along the coast just north of Hilo, it's epic, it's incredible. And I think that this is a cultural value in our state. What you don't see when you search the hashtag is pictures like this. Those areas of our islands where I think we really feel like we've lost control, that there aren't spaces for local people. You don't see pictures like this, the paving over of our prime agricultural land to allow for, the building of houses, many of which local people can't afford. People definitely don't hashtag that, Lucky We Live Hawaii. All of the, externalities of a growing population in our state. So I think that Lucky We Live Hawaii might also give us a cultural roadmap to understand sort of the tenor of the debate and sort of where we should go moving forward. If we feel a sense of gratitude for being here, then, what comes next is a sense of responsibility to take care of that place. And in many ways, this is the value of kuleana. Right? If you have a responsibility to care for a place, that responsibility seeks opportunity. So, in 2011, I went to an event on the North Shore of Oahu. That little girl right there is my daughter. That's Jack Johnson. She did this solo dance in front of like 500 people. And I bring this up not only because I'm thinking about quitting my job and becoming a dance mom, but also because at that event I had a real aha moment. We were there honoring a woman named Cora Sanchez. Cora Sanchez is a longtime community activist on the North Shore of Oahu who has fought tirelessly to preserve the rural integrity of that community and also protect its environmental resources. She helped establish the Marine District of Sharks Cove. She helped establish Surfrider. And this is a woman who has fought to keep Hawaii a place where we feel lucky to live. And I realize that Cora is a part of a long tradition of activism in the state of Hawaii that has really kept our state somewhere that is so incredibly beautiful and untamed. And now when I look out at all of the waterfalls that are here on Hawaii Islands, rivers that can flow Mauka to Makai, unlike our waters that are diverted on Maui and Oahu. I've been starting to think about all of the community activism that's behind that. All of the people that have been investing their time and their energy in keeping Hawaii a place where we feel lucky to live. And that is, I think, what Kuleana is. It's stepping up when you think that there's a threat to something that you love. But it's also a question of justice. I had this realization, again, early on in my time here, that so many people think that the GMO debate is about labeling food and the potential safety of GMOs when consumed. And labeling is an interesting question because in some ways it democratizes access to the information, right? If it's on the label, potentially anybody can figure it out. But it also speaks to those individual actions that we can take. I can get an iPhone app that tells me what products have genetically engineered ingredients in it. I can educate myself on the organic standards and understand that organics don't have genetic engineering as a part of that standard. So there are individual actions that I can take in this whole GMO debate that allow me to feel empowered. But that's actually not what's happening here in the islands of our state. In fact, what we're experiencing is the environmental and public health impacts of growing and producing genetically engineered crops. And no individual person can stand outside of their home, stand outside of their children's school and say, industry, this is actually a pesticide drift-free zone. We're personally regulating this space. No, only the government can do that. That is the purpose of government, to regulate things that individuals can't regulate, to ensure their freedom to exist free from those harms. So it's not just a responsibility that we might be protecting our environmental and public health resources from potentially negative impacts. That's not why we organize this issue, around this issue. But we're also organizing to demand action from those agencies and from a government who is the only institution capable of protecting our children and our broader public health. Over the past, we've been thinking about what are the next steps, if you feel a sense of responsibility and want to engage on this issue, what are those productive spaces of engagement? One, we're really asking people to support buffer zones and disclosure legislation at the state level. We have 3 cases that are currently under litigation on the islands of Hawaii, Hawaiian Island, and Maui. And the primary question is, who has the authority to regulate pesticides and GMOs in the state of Hawaii? And right now, as it currently stands, the findings are that it is the state of Hawaii that has the authority. The Center for Food Safety is a part of the legal team that's appealing that decision, and we feel really confident about what's going to happen at the Court of Appeals. But right now, as it currently stands, if the state is the level of government that should be regulating pesticides and genetic engineering to ensure health and safety, then I think we really need to push for that legislation there. Second, we're really encouraging people to run for office. Anybody who's sort of been mired in this debate understands what it means to have an ally in office, somebody that's willing to use their power to educate their community and advance our policy goals. And we need more people in government. We need that turnover. Elections are part of the lifeblood of our democratic process. It's not just voting, it's also, actively taking part. We're asking people to educate their community. There's a sign-up sheet going around, and if you're interested in having a presentation like this, we're available. Okay? And I think also hosting your own talk stories, your own conversations in your community is what's going to be effective. And then finally, engaging youth to act, to really feel empowered to participate. We've been speaking at schools across the state, and recently I was speaking at a middle school. And, it's amazing. For many kids, the kinds of connections that we're drawing are very intuitive to them. They want to see a Hawaii that grows its own food. They don't like the idea of, potentially supporting an economic sector that could have, massive environmental harm. And at the end of the presentation, the kids are kind of raising their hands and asking, oh, how did this happen? What's going on? And I was like, okay, guys, well, let's start with this. What kind of government do we have? And the kids, 30 of them, all shouted out, a bad one. And I was like, oh no, really? And I was like, no, it's a democracy. But I think our kids feel incredibly disempowered in the spaces that they're given to affect change. And I think the more that we look to our youth and empower them to be agents of change in their own lives and in their communities, the more we allow them to take ownership over the future we're creating for them. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about long-term toxicological impacts, some of these things are only going to manifest in their adult lifetimes. And I think we really need to give them space in the debate to talk about what they want for the future of our state. What is their imagination of Hawaii in 20 years, and what kind of agriculture do they want to see here? You can check out, again, all iterations of the report, and we have a ton of collateral materials on our website. Allie is going to be around after tonight to, talk to any of you guys if you'd like to schedule presentations. And I always end oftentimes with this quote. And it's a quote by Arundhati Roy, because I think it fuses that question of kuleana and responsibility with the question of government. Why are we taking this battle to policy? Why are we taking it? Why aren't we just also actively creating the alternatives in our everyday lives? And Arundhati Roy writes, our freedoms, such as they are, were never given to us by any government. They have been wrested by us. If we do not test them from time to time, they will atrophy. If we do not guard them constantly, they will be taken away from us. If we do not demand more and more, we will be left with less and less. My sense is that if we don't demand more and more in terms of regulation from our state, we're going to be left with less and less of an environment to give to our children, and less of a thriving, healthy life for them. So thank you.